Welcome back from the break. I hope you're ready to carry on with the lesson. Okay. Right, so we've had a look at the biological concepts. We've had a look at our lines of evidence, our different species. We're now going to have a look at the various forms of evidence that we have for human evolution. Okay, so first of all, we're going to have a look at fossil evidence. And if you have a look, we're going to talk about transitional species. Now, we've mentioned it in previous lessons, and we also mentioned it just a bit earlier, and we spoke about what a transitional species is. And here we see transitional species basically shows intermediate. So in other words, it's kind of the middle between two other genera or species. Okay, so they show intermediate characteristics. So if we have a look here at the diagram here, we can see over here we have dinosaurs, okay, and here we have the pigeon. Right, so our transitional species, so those are two different species, and our transitional species would be what we call, or what is known as, is Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx was a fossil that was found in a lake in Germany, and what they discovered is that if you have a look at the structure of this bird, because it had feathers and it had wings, it's quite dinosaur-like if you have a look at the skeletal structure, yet it had feathers and it had wings, which is more bird-like. And so we can see that it had characteristics that were similar or common to the bird. Okay, so it had those characteristics as well as those characteristics that were common to reptiles. All right, because remember, dinosaurs were reptiles. So they've got claws, and they had scaly legs. So there were scales on the legs, there were claws, but yet there were also feathers and wings, which then was the common characteristics to both. So your transitional species then, as I said, has characteristics that are common to both the ancestor species, which in this case would be the dinosaurs, and the descendant species that follows, which in this case is the pigeon or the bird. All right, now let's have a look at the important fossil sites that we find in Africa. And again, I said to you that in the exams they will focus on those aspects in the topic that are relevant to South Africa and to Africa. So it's important that you know these, you know the difference, you know where they are, and then when you learn the different species, you know where they were specifically found. Okay, so we have a look at the sites in Africa. More closely, a very important fossil or an area where we found lots and lots of fossils is the Great Rift Valley, which is about a 2,000-kilometer geological feature across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. Okay, so if we have a look here on the diagram there, you can see it's highlighted very nicely. So it's quite a large area, and it stretches over quite a few of the countries in Africa. So it has quite a few sites there. You can see there's Hadar and Middle Awash, Omo and Turkana, the Old Divide Gorge and Latoli. So that's where the Rift Valley, the Great Rift Valley then stretches across. Okay, and there were numerous fossil sites that were found in this Rift Valley. Right, then specifically in South Africa, we look at and we call it the Cradle of Humankind, and we know that the Cradle of Humankind has been declared a national heritage site. So it's very important that we preserve that area, and we look after the environment there. We look after all the findings, the cave sites that are there, and you saw because they're very rich in fossil evidence, and it's not only a national heritage site, it's actually an international heritage site. So from paleontologists, scientists, biologists from all over the world come here to actually study the fossils that have been found at the Cradle of Humankind. The Cradle of Humankind then basically has quite a few fossil sites, if you like, or caves, or areas where fossils have been found. And that's, if you have a look here on the diagram, you can see that part of Cradle of Humankind is Sterkfontein Caves, Swartkrans, Krom Dry, Plovers Lake, Gladys Vale Cave, and then Malapa and Drimmelen. Okay, now what's important is you'll notice there that most of those are either caves or they talk about Plovers Lake. Remember when we learnt about fossils and how fossils are formed, we said that mostly we find fossils that of organisms that either lived in bodies of water or fell into a body of water and they died there, and then their bodies then were fossilized, or their remains were fossilized. And that is why we find where there was previously water, or there is still water, then we find, in the rock layers, we find a rich source of fossils. So important to know then, in the Cradle of Humankind, we have the caves, or the area, Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, Krom Dry, Plovers Lake, Gladys Vale, and that's we found, or in those areas, Australopithecus africanus has been found, who lived about 3 million years ago. Homo habilis, about 2 million years ago. Homo erectus, Paranthropus robustus, which is also an Australopithecus, Australopithecine, and all of those fossils were found here. So we have a really rich source of fossil evidence. Okay. And then you can see that there are other areas. We said Blombos Cave is in the Western Cape, Classy's River Cave, Sibudu Cave, Border Cave. Those are in other provinces as well. Then the next source of evidence that we find for human evolution is what we call genetic evidence. And here, what we do is we use the DNA that we find in mitochondria. So if we have a look in this diagram here, you'll see specifically it's mitochondrial DNA, which we find in the mitochondria. Now, the reason why we use mitochondrial DNA is because nuclear DNA, as you know, is a very large, very large molecule, and with many genes. I can't tell you how many, thousands of genes, but it has a huge amount. So mitochondrial DNA is much shorter DNA, and it's actually easier. So then the mutations that occur in mitochondrial DNA happen quite a lot quicker than in nuclear DNA. Plus, we also know that mitochondrial DNA is passed down in the maternal line. So mitochondrial DNA is used, so it comes from the cell, and it's much simpler, as I said, than nuclear DNA, and it's used to study the ancestry of females, and that is because it is passed down from the mother. So mitochondrial DNA is passed down the maternal line. Okay. All right. And as I mentioned just now, that mutations would then take place much quicker than nuclear DNA. So this is why we use mitochondrial DNA. And please note that we abbreviate a mitochondrial DNA. We put an MT. So in other words, we write MT and then we write DNA. if we abbreviate that. Okay. So that is what it is known as. Right, so mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA, it comes from the mother's ovum, which contains the mitochondria. When it's fertilized by the sperm cell, and it then becomes the zygote. So the mitochondria comes from the mother. So here we see, in this diagram here, we see the ovum with mitochondria, and when that is fertilized, remember when the sperm cell penetrates the ovum, all that goes in is actually the nucleus. So the head will then penetrate, and it's the nucleus of the sperm cell that fuses with the nucleus of the egg cell. So the rest of the cell that's going to form the zygote comes from the ovum. So therefore, it's the mitochondria that come from the ovum that actually then form the zygote, or the next generation. And here you can see, we know that the mitochondria are situated in the neck region of the sperm, and that part is discarded. So that does not fuse with the ovum. So that is why we know that the mitochondria then come from the mother's body, or her cells. Okay, so the father's mitochondria, as we say, are not part of the zygote. All right. If we have a look, what they've managed to do with the mitochondrial DNA, they've now discovered, or they've managed to trace that the mitochondrial DNA, they've managed to trace back all the way to an ancestor, a very early ancestor, the oldest female ancestor that they believe. And she comes from East Africa. So, and the way in which they discovered it, that is, they analyzed the mutations that they found in the mitochondrial DNA. And they then discovered that those mutations, there's a lot more mutations than in females that occur elsewhere in the world. So the females in Africa, and that's how they then determined that the earliest ancestor then is traced back to having originated in Africa. So that's the mitochondrial DNA. Okay, then we have a look at cultural evidence. And cultural evidence is all the tools and the implements and the ornaments and the way in which species lived. So when they find fossils and they find a fossil site, they won't only just find fossilized bones, they would also find pieces of whatever, clay pots and things like that were made, created. They'd find tools, they would find animal remains. So for example, skeletons of animals that might have been eaten by the species that lived in that site previously. So all of those things tell a big, they are a great contribution, or a large contribution to the story of that species that lived there and how they lived. Okay, so we look specifically at cultural evidence and tool making, because we see that organisms started to use tools. They used stone tools for cutting and sawing. Okay, and what that did is, as soon as they were able to cut things, it then improved the nutrition. So now they were able to cut, and they were able to eat animal flesh, so animal matter, and not only plants. And as soon as that happened, it improved their nutrition, because we know that there's a lot more nutrients in animal tissue than there is in plant tissue. So it was definitely an improvement. Okay, development of stone tools became more sophisticated. So in other words, they weren't just basic. Here you can see in this picture here, you can see there's sort of a basic stone that they've kind of created a sharp edge. And then they became a little bit more sophisticated. So this one is a bit more elongated and has a sharper point at the top here. This one you can see is almost like an arrow shape, and it has been flattened out on these surfaces to make very sharp edges, as well as a nice sharp point. and here this one too, and is even smaller and possibly easier to handle, would be easier to hold. Right, so when we have a look, and the reason why we look at tools is because we see that as they developed these tools, what it required was planning and thought. So it means that humans, their thought processing and the way they were thinking and planning was beginning to evolve, which actually is an indication that the brain capacity is increasing. Then we also find cave paintings as evidence of symbolic thought. And here we see that, you know, we can see as time goes on, so this is the increasing complexity of the tools as time increases and goes closer to the present, and we can see how the tools actually changed. Okay. All right, that's all we have time for. All right, that's all we have time for. We're going to take a short break, and we'll see you back after the break.